Spring of 1940.
everywhere.
Let me
Across
check
a
the
burning
flow.
Europe, there was one
Feels
word that had
cold,
become
but
the
it'll
most
do.
terrifying
We
sound a
have
human
to
being could
move
hear.
now. But
Not
where?
bomb,
There's
not
nowhere.
death, not surrender. The word was shower. In the death camps scattered across the continent, millions of people had walked into rooms marked with signs that read, Brausebad, shower room. They were told to undress. They were told they would be cleaned. They were told everything would be fine. But from those shower heads came not water. From those shower heads came Zyklon B, poison gas. And no one who walked into those rooms ever walked out again. But this story is not about death. This story is about the moment when a simple American soldier from a small farm in Ohio decided that even enemies deserve to be treated like human beings. What happened next would echo across 25 years and prove that even in the darkest chapters of human history, mercy can survive. The thunder of Allied artillery rolled across the Rhineland like the drumbeat of Judgment Day. The Third Reich was collapsing piece by piece, a burning cathedral of hatred, finally crumbling under the weight of its own sins. Smoke from destroyed convoys hung in the gray sky, mixing with the bitter smell of oil, blood, and ash. The roads were littered with the corpses of tanks and trucks, the scattered debris of an army in full retreat. Lieutenant Thomas Mitchell stood on a small hill overlooking the carnage below. He was 26 years old, though the war had aged him far beyond his years. His eyes carried the weight of 4 years of combat, of friends buried in foreign soil, of nightmares that would never fully fade. The men called him Tom. Back home in Ohio, before the world caught fire, his father had called him Tommy. Tom was not like the other officers. He did not come from West Point or from families with long military traditions stretching back generations. He came from a cornfield outside Columbus, Ohio, where mornings began with the smell of bacon frying in his mother's kitchen and ended with sunsets painting the wheat fields in shades of gold and red. His hands had learned to hold a plow before they learned to hold a rifle. His heart had learned to love the land before it learned to hate the enemy. But his mother had died when he was 12. Pneumonia, the doctor said. Nothing could be done. And his father, Walter Mitchell, a man with calloused hands and a gentle heart, had raised Tom alone on that farm. Walter taught him how to plant and harvest, how to repair a fence and shoe a horse. But more than anything, Walter taught him about the measure of a man. And now Walter was gone too. A heart attack, sudden and merciless, had taken him while Tom was fighting in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. Tom never got to say goodbye. He never got to tell his father that he understood everything Walter had tried to teach him about strength and mercy and what it truly meant to be a man. Tom reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. It showed Walter standing in front of the barn, back home, smiling under the Ohio sun. The photograph was creased and faded after 4 years of war, but his father's smile was still clear. Tom looked at it for a long moment, then tucked it back against his heart. Before we go any deeper into this story, I want to ask you something. If you or someone in your family served in World War II, leave a comment below. This story is for your generation, the generation that sacrificed everything so the world could be free. And if you want to hear more true stories from history that the textbooks never tell, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Now let us return to Germany in the spring of 1945. The memory came to Tom unbidden, rising from somewhere deep inside him. Ohio, autumn of 1941. The cornfields stretched to the horizon, golden stalks rustling in the cool breeze. Tom was 22 years old, helping his father bring in the last harvest before winter. The radio in the kitchen was playing the announcer's voice, grave and urgent. Pearl Harbor has been attacked. Walter Mitchell stopped what he was doing and looked at his son. The two men stood in the middle of the field, wind whipping through the corn, creating a sound like whispered prophecy. "You will go," Walter said. It was not a question. "I have to, Pa." Walter nodded slowly. He had served in the Great War in the trenches of France. He knew what war was. He knew what it could do to a man's soul. "I am not worried that you are not strong enough to fight," Walter said, placing his hand on Tom's shoulder. "I am worried that you will forget how to be human in the middle of hell." Tom did not understand then. But 4 years later, standing on German soil with a pistol on his hip and the blood of enemies on his boots, he was beginning to understand. There will come a moment, Walter had continued, his grip tightening on Tom's shoulder, when you stand before a helpless enemy. They will be completely in your power. You could do anything to them, and no one would blame you. Walter's eyes blew as the Ohio sky held his son's gaze. That moment will be the most important of your life, not when you win, but when you choose how to treat the defeated. What do you want me to do, Poe? I want you to remember that true strength is not in how many men you can kill. It is in choosing not to kill when you have every reason to. Walter smiled sadly. That is what makes you who you are. That is what makes you American. The train whistle had blown. It was time to go. Promise me, Walter said. Promise me that no matter what the war turns you into, you will not forget how to be a man. Tom had hugged his father, feeling the rough fabric of Walter's work coat against his cheek. I promise, Pa. Now standing in the ruins of Germany, Tom pulled out the photograph again. His father's smile looked back at him across the years. I promise, Tom whispered into the cold wind. I will not forget. Sergeant, a voice called out, snapping Tom back to the present. Lieutenant Mitchell, we have movement in the village ahead. Sergeant Frank Sullivan approached, a cigarette dangling from his lips. Sullivan was 38 years old, a veteran of North Africa, with scars on his face from shrapnel and eyes that had seen too much death to be surprised by anything anymore. He was tough as leather and twice as weathered, but underneath that hard exterior, Tom knew there was a man he could trust with his life. What kind of movement, Tom asked. Scouts say there is activity in a farmhouse on the edge of town. Could be Wehrmacht stragglers, could be civilians, could be a trap. Tom nodded, checking his sidearm. Assemble the squad. We are going in. The American soldiers advanced through a road littered with abandoned German vehicles. Every step was cautious. Every shadow was a potential threat. After 4 years of war, they knew that death could come from anywhere. A sniper in a ruined building, a mine buried in the mud, a desperate soldier with one last grenade and nothing left to lose. Private Jimmy Dawson, 19 years old and fresh from Texas, gripped his rifle with trembling hands. He was the youngest man in the unit, and this was his first time at the front in a real combat situation. His older brother, a Navy lieutenant, had died at Normandy on D-Day itself. That loss had hardened Jimmy's heart against anything German. When they reached the farmhouse at the edge of the village, Tom raised his fist. The squad stopped. There were sounds coming from inside. Whispers, footsteps, movement. Surround the building, Tom ordered, in a low voice. Sullivan took a team around the back. Tom and 5 others aimed their weapons at the front door. Roused Tom shouted in the German he had learned, Hände hoch, come out, hands up. A moment of terrible silence. Every finger rested on every trigger. Hearts pounded. Breath came in short, shallow gasps. Then the door opened. What stepped out was not German soldiers. What stepped out was women. 12 women in faded gray uniforms, their insignia hastily torn away. Some wore Red Cross armbands. Others looked like clerks or signal operators. Mud streaked their faces. Their hair was matted and filthy. Their eyes were hollow with exhaustion and fear. One of them, barely more than a girl, held up a piece of white cloth, a handkerchief, a makeshift flag of surrender. The American soldiers stared in confusion. In 4 years of fighting, they had encountered every kind of enemy: fanatical Wehrmacht troops, brutal SS officers, Hitler youth teenagers brainwashed since childhood. But women are rendering in the middle of nowhere. Tom signaled his men to lower their weapons. Check them for weapons. The soldiers moved forward, carefully searching each woman. There were no weapons, only empty canteens, a few crumpled letters, a small tin of moldy biscuits, and fear. Fear so raw and visible that it seemed to have its own presence in the cold morning air. The woman at the front of the group stepped forward. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23. Her hair was pale blonde, dirty and tangled, but her blue eyes held a strange calmness amid the terror, a quiet dignity that the war had not yet managed to destroy. We are not soldiers, she said in broken English, her voice trembling but steady. We are prisoners. Please. Tom studied her face. There was something in her eyes that he recognized. Not defiance, not hatred, something else, something human. Her name, he would later learn, was Helga Brenner. She was 22 years old, a former nurse at a military hospital in Hamburg. She had witnessed her city burned to the ground during the Allied bombing campaign of 1943. Operation Gomorrah, they called it. More than 40,000 people died in 1 week. Her father, a surgeon who refused to abandon his patients, had perished when the hospital collapsed around him. But Tom did not know any of this yet. At that moment, she was just another prisoner of war, one of thousands his unit had encountered on the long road through Germany. Tom ordered the women taken to a nearby barn that had been converted into a temporary holding area for prisoners. The men called it the pen, a crude name but accurate. The prisoners would be treated according to regulations, but there would be no warmth, no sympathy, not for the enemy. That evening, Tom held a meeting with his officers in the command tent. The air was thick with tension and cigarette smoke. "So what do we do with these German women?" Sullivan asked, lighting another cigarette. The flame illuminated the deep lines on his face, the marks of 3 years of continuous combat. "We hold them according to Geneva rules," Tom replied. "They are prisoners of war. Prisoners of war," Jimmy Dawson scoffed. The young Texan's hatred burned bright in his eyes. "They are just women who worked for the Nazis, Lieutenant. They deserve whatever they get, Dawson." Tom's voice turned sharp as steel. "They are wearing uniforms. They served in the enemy military. By law, they are POWs. End of discussion." But Tom knew it was not the end. Many of the men in his unit had lost friends in this war, lost brothers, lost pieces of themselves that they would never get back. Their eyes looked at anything in German gray with something darker than suspicion. Sullivan blew out a stream of smoke. "The lieutenant is right about the rules, but do not expect the boys to be happy about it. A lot of them buried friends at the Bulge. A lot of them saw things in those villages that they will never forget." Tom understood. He had lost people too. His best friend, Lieutenant Robert Chen, had died in his arms at Ardennes, blood staining the white snow crimson. Every time Tom saw a German uniform, part of him still wanted revenge. But another part of him, the part his father had nurtured in the fields of Ohio, knew that hatred would not bring Robert back, and it would not make Tom a better man. "Maintain discipline," Tom ordered. "No one does anything outside of regulations. Clear?" "Clear, sir," the officers replied, but Tom could see the reluctance in some of their eyes. Later that night, Tom walked past the barn where the women were being held. Through a crack in the door, he could see them huddled together in the straw, whispering in German, shivering in the cold. Some still wore their Red Cross armbands, reminders that they had once cared for wounded soldiers. Now they were completely powerless. Tom thought about his mother. She'd been a nurse too at a small hospital in Columbus. He remembered how she cared for her patients, never asking who they were or where they came from. "Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity," she used to say. He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. This was war. These women were the enemy. He should not be thinking of them as human beings. But they were human beings. Tom turned away and walked back to his tent. That night, he did not sleep. The next morning, Tom was studying maps in the command tent when a guard rushed in. "Lieutenant, one of the female prisoners wants to speak with you." Tom frowned. "About what?" "She keeps repeating a word. Wash or shower or something like that." Tom stood and followed the guard outside. Helga Brenner was standing near the barn, her hands clasped tightly in front of her chest. Her blue eyes were anxious but determined. "Lieutenant," she said slowly, clearly having practiced the words many times in her head. "I asked for permission. One thing." "What do you want?" Helga swallowed hard. Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes never left his. "We have not washed for many weeks. Very dirty. Very—" She searched for the word shame. "Please, sir, let us wash." Tom stared at her in silence. The request in the context of a war filled with death and destruction sounded almost absurd. These women were citizens of a regime that had bombed London, that had built the death camps now being uncovered across Europe. "Shower," he repeated. "You want to shower?" "Yes." Helga nodded, her blue eyes meeting his without flinching. "Shower, please." But there was something in the way she said that word, a hesitation, a flicker of fear that crossed her eyes before she could hide it. Tom did not understand then, but he would soon learn that the word shower had become the most terrifying word in all of Europe, and that these women, knowing exactly what that word could mean, had asked for one anyway. That was when Tom noticed something else, a strange smell drifting on the wind from the east, not the familiar smell of battlefield death. This was something different, something heavier, something that made his stomach turn in a way he could not explain. He did not know yet where that smell was coming from. He did not know about the camp that lay abandoned just a few miles away, its fences still standing, its mass graves still fresh. But he would find out soon enough. And when he did, everything would change. What happened in the next 24 hours would transform Tom Mitchell forever. Not because of a battle, not because of a victory, but because of a decision about water soap and the dignity of human beings. The women were taken back to the barn. Tom returned to his duties. But the image of Helga's face stayed with him, the way fear and hope had mixed in her blue eyes when she spoke that terrible word. Shower. In the death camps, it meant the end. In this moment, it meant something else entirely. It meant trust. It meant believing that these American soldiers were different from the monsters who had built Auschwitz and Treblinka. It meant believing that humanity could still exist in the heart of hell. Tom did not know if that belief was justified. He did not know if he had the strength to be the man his father had raised him to be. But he was about to find out. Tom brought the request to the afternoon meeting. The reaction was exactly what he expected. Sullivan burst out laughing, the cigarette nearly falling from his lips. "You want to set up a spa for the enemy, Lieutenant? We are in the middle of a war, not running a resort." Laughter rippled through the tent. A few soldiers whistled mockingly. The tension that had been building since the women arrived found an outlet in cruel humor. But Corporal Eddie Kowalski did not laugh. He was 28 years old, Polish by blood, quiet by nature. His family had lived in Warsaw before the war. Or rather, they had lived in Warsaw before the Germans turned that ancient city into rubble and ash. Kowalski rarely spoke, but when he did, men listened. Lieutenant Kowalski said, his voice cutting through the laughter. "May I say something?" "Go ahead." "Did you notice how she said the word shower?" Kowalski's dark eyes met Tom's. She was afraid when she said it. The laughter died. Sullivan stopped mid-chuckle, the cigarette frozen between his fingers. Kowalski continued, his voice dropping lower. "Before the war, I had relatives in Krakow. They wrote letters telling us about the German showers." His eyes darkened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. No one who walked into those rooms ever walked out alive. The tent fell completely silent. Even the distant sound of artillery seemed to fade. Sullivan exhaled slowly, all trace of mockery gone from his weathered face. "You are saying those women think we are going to gas them?" "I am saying," Kowalski replied, "that the word shower has become the most terrifying word in Europe. Millions of people have died in rooms marked with that word." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the assembled men. And those women still asked for one. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. The pieces were falling into place now. The fear in Helga's eyes when she spoke that word. The trembling in her voice. The way she had forced herself to say it anyway, knowing what it might mean. "So she knows about those rooms," Sullivan said quietly, no longer mocking. "And she still asked to shower. They are so desperate to feel clean." Kowalski answered that they are willing to risk death for it, or maybe they believe we are different. The silence stretched on. Men who had laughed moments ago now stared at the ground. They had seen many terrible things in this war, but the thought of those gas chambers, of people being told they were going to bathe, and instead being murdered, made even hardened combat veterans shudder. Tom looked around the tent at his men. These were soldiers who had killed and watched their friends die. These were men who had every reason to hate anything wearing German gray. But in this moment, something had shifted. The enemy had become human. That night, Tom could not sleep. He lay on his cot staring at the canvas ceiling while distant artillery rumbled like summer thunder. But his mind was far away back in Ohio, back to a conversation he had never forgotten. He thought about his father, about the promise he had made at the train station in Columbus, about what Walter Mitchell had taught him regarding the measure of a man. The memory rose up unbidden vivid as the day had happened. The train platform, the smell of coal smoke, his father's rough hand gripping his shoulder. "There will come a moment," Walter had said, "when you stand before a helpless enemy. They will be completely in your power. You could do anything to them, and no one would blame you." Tom remembered how his father's blue eyes, the same shade as the Ohio sky, had held his gaze with fierce intensity. That moment will be the most important of your life, not when you win, but when you choose how to treat the defeated. "What do you want me to do, Pa?" "I want you to remember that true strength is not in how many men you can kill. It is in choosing not to kill when you have every reason to." Walter had smiled, then a sad smile full of hard-won wisdom. "That is what makes you who you are. That is what makes you American." Tom sat up in the darkness of his tent. His father was gone, but the promise remained. "I promise, Pa," he whispered to the empty night. "I will not forget." The decision had been made. At dawn, Tom assembled his squad outside the command tent. The morning air was cold and damp, carrying the lingering smell of smoke from somewhere to the east. We are going to set up a field shower system for the prisoners, Tom announced. Silence. Then Sullivan spoke, his voice carefully neutral. You sure about this, Lieutenant? I am sure. No one argued loudly. Perhaps the conversation about the gas chambers had changed something. Perhaps they were simply too tired to keep hating. Sullivan assigned a detail to gather the necessary equipment. A water tank, a small pump, canvas sheets for privacy, nothing fancy, just enough for a basic wash. By noon, the system was ready. It was crude but functional. Water from a large tank would be pumped through a pipe with holes drilled in it, creating a makeshift showerhead. Canvas tarps formed walls around the washing area, giving the bathers some measure of dignity. Tom went to the barn to deliver the news. Helga translated for the others, her voice rising with disbelief as she explained what the Americans had built. The reaction was not what Tom expected. Instead of joy, several women shrank back in fear. Greta, the dark-haired radio operator, began to weep. Others clutched each other, whispering frantically in German. They do not believe it. Helga explained, her own voice trembling. They think this is a trap, Tom understood. After everything they had heard about showers, trust was the most expensive luxury in the world. Then I will prove it, he said. He walked into the shower area and turned on the pump himself. Water flowed from the holes in the pipe. Real water, clear and cold. Tom held out his hand and let it run through his fingers, droplets splashing onto the muddy ground. Water, he said simply. Just water. The first two women entered hesitantly, their eyes darting around the enclosure, searching for hidden danger. American soldiers stood guard outside, their backs turned to preserve the bathers' privacy. A long moment of terrible silence. Then the sound of water falling, splashing, running. Real water, not poison gas, not death, just clean water raining down from a pipe pooling on the earth below. From outside the canvas walls, the remaining women waited in agonized suspense. Helga stood at the front, her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her lips moved silently, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in desperate hope. Minutes passed. Then the first two women emerged. Their hair was wet. Their faces were clean. One of them pressed a towel against her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks. The other smiled. It was a small smile, fragile as a flower pushing through frozen ground. But it was real. Wasser, they whispered to the others. Echtes Wasser. Water. Real water. A murmur ran through the group of women. Wonder. Relief. Something that might have been the first stirring of hope in months. One by one, in groups of two, they took their turns. American soldiers stood guard, and a few of them began offering small gifts. A chocolate bar, a cigarette, a tin of canned meat, gestures of humanity that needed no translation. Tom stood near the shower tent, watching the scene unfold. The setting sun painted the German hills in shades of orange and gold, casting long shadows across the wreckage of a nation. He thought about how strange this moment was, how something as simple as water could mean more than any victory. But the peace of that moment would not last, because not far from where they stood, just a few miles to the east, there was a secret waiting to be discovered, a secret that would change everything. The next morning, Corporal Kowalski found Tom outside the command tent. Lieutenant, I have something important. His face was grave. The previous night, he had spoken with Greta, the radio operator, using what little German he knew. She had told him about a place, a labor camp for prisoners located not far from where her unit had been stationed. The Germans had abandoned it a few days before the American advance reached the area. She does not know what happened to the people inside, Kowalski said, but she knows the camp is still there. Tom felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning cold. Over the past week, his unit had stumbled upon the edges of horror. The smell of decay drifting from locked barns, the silence of empty barracks, the rumors spreading like wildfire through the American forces about what the Germans had done in places called Auschwitz and Buchenwald and Dachau. Tom sent a small reconnaissance team to investigate. Sullivan led them. They left at first light and returned a few hours later. When Sullivan climbed out of the jeep, his face was the color of old paper. His eyes were empty. The cigarette in his hand had burned down to a stub without being smoked. What did you find? Tom asked, though he already knew the answer. Sullivan tried to light a fresh cigarette. His hand shook so badly that it took 3 attempts. Fences, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Empty barracks and graves. His jaw tightened. Hundreds of people, Lieutenant. Maybe thousands. We only saw the edge of it. He handed Tom a rotting wooden sign. The words were in German. Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. It was the motto that had hung above the gates of the death camps. The cruelest lie in human history. Now I want to ask you something. What would you have done in Tom's position, knowing what he now knew about the horrors that had taken place just miles away? Would you still have shown mercy to those who served the regime that built such places? Think about that. And if this story is making you feel something, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like this deserve to be remembered. When Tom told the women that the camp had been found, the reactions were mixed. Some broke down in tears. Greta sat in silence, staring at nothing, as if she had known all along and had simply been waiting for confirmation. One woman fainted and had to be carried to the medical tent. Helga stood apart from the others, her face unreadable. Tom approached her. "You knew about that camp." Helga nodded slowly. "We knew there was a camp nearby. We were not allowed to go near it." She looked down at her hands. "But we could smell it. When the wind blew from the east, we could smell it. And you did nothing. What could we do?" Helga's blue eyes were filled with pain. "We were nurses and clerks. We had no weapons. We had no power. We could only close our eyes and pray that someday it would end." Tom wanted to be angry. He wanted to blame her, to hold her accountable for the horrors that had been committed by her countrymen. But looking into her eyes, he saw something he recognized. The helplessness of someone caught in a machine far larger than themselves. He had felt that way too. In battles where he could not save his comrades. In nights when he woke screaming from dreams of blood and fire. The line between victim and perpetrator, between the defeated and the damned, was blurring in ways he had never expected. Before Tom could fully process what he had learned, the sound of an engine cut through the morning air. A jeep pulled up outside the camp and a tall, thin man in an officer's uniform stepped out. Major Richard Harwood. He was 45 years old with a face like a knife blade and eyes the color of cold steel. He carried a clipboard and wore an expression that suggested he had already found everyone guilty of something. Tom's stomach tightened. Harwood was from Regional Command. His presence here could only mean trouble. The major walked through the camp without greeting anyone, his eyes scanning everything. The tents, the supply depot, the shower system, and especially the German women sitting in the sunlight, their hair still damp from washing. Harwood stopped in front of the water tank and pump. He examined the canvas walls, the pipe with its holes, the puddles of water on the ground. Then he turned to Tom with an expression of disbelief. "What exactly is this, Lieutenant Mitchell, the sanitation system for the prisoners, sir, according to Geneva Convention regulations?" "I know the Geneva Convention," Harwood interrupted, his voice cold as winter. "What I want to know is why you are using military resources to build a bathhouse for the enemy. Sir, this is not a bathhouse. Half the division is talking about how Lieutenant Mitchell is bathing German women in the middle of a combat zone." Harwood stepped closer, lowering his voice to a dangerous whisper. "Do you have any idea what kind of message that sends? It makes us look weak. It makes us look soft." Tom felt his anger rising, but he kept his voice level. "With respect, sir, I believe treating prisoners humanely sends exactly the right message." Humanely, Harwood laughed without humor. "Do you know who these people served? A regime that murdered millions. And you want to give them showers." The irony of that statement hung in the air. Showers. The word that had meant death in the camps. The word that now meant life in this small American outpost. That evening, Harwood called a meeting with all officers. The atmosphere in the command tent was suffocating. "Here is the situation," Harwood began, slapping his clipboard on the table. "Lieutenant Mitchell has been using military resources for unauthorized purposes. This is a violation of protocol." Sir Tom started to speak as Geneva Convention requires. Geneva requires humane treatment, not luxury accommodations. Harwood's palm struck the table with a crack like a rifle shot. "The problem is not resources. The problem is the message." He stood and paced the tent, his shadow moving across the canvas walls like a predator stalking prey. "We are in the final days of this war. The army needs to see that we are strong, determined, uncompromising. And what are you doing? You are running a bathhouse for Hitler's girls." Sullivan spoke up, his voice rougher than usual. "Sir, if I may." "You may not, Sergeant." But Sullivan continued anyway. I was the first one to think this shower business was crazy. I thought the lieutenant had lost his mind. He paused to light a cigarette, and Tom noticed that his hands were steadier than they had been since returning from the camp. But then we found that labor camp a few miles from here. Harwood stopped pacing. I saw what was there. Sir Sullivan continued, his voice dropping. Barbed wire, mass graves, bodies stacked like firewood. He inhaled deeply, the cigarette's tip glowing orange in the dim tent. If we treat those women the way the Nazis treated their prisoners, what makes us any different from them? The tent fell silent. Even Harwood seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Then the major's expression hardened again. Very touching, Sergeant. But I am not here for moral philosophy. I am here to ensure military discipline is maintained. He gathered his papers and turned to Tom. Lieutenant Mitchell, you have 48 hours. After that, I will return with a decision from Division Command. If they determine that you have violated regulations, he paused, letting the threat hang in the air, you will face a court-martial. Harwood strode out of the tent, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. That night, Tom sat alone in front of his tent, staring up at a sky full of stars. His military career might end in 48 hours. Everything he had worked for, everything he had survived, could be destroyed because of a water tank and some canvas sheets. Helga approached quietly, her footsteps soft on the muddy ground. You are not sleeping. Neither are you. She sat down nearby, keeping a respectful distance between them. I heard about the officer, about the punishment you might face. Tom did not ask how she knew. Word traveled fast in a camp this size. I am sorry, Helga said softly. Because of us, you are in trouble. It is not your fault. I made the decision. But why? Her voice held genuine curiosity. Why did you do this? We are the enemy. My country has done terrible things. Tom was silent for a long moment. Then he told her about his father, about the promise, about how Walter Mitchell had lived and died believing that human dignity mattered more than victory. Helga listened without interrupting. Your father, she said when he finished, he sounds like my father. You think so? Both believe that how we treat others defines who we are. She smiled sadly. Perhaps your father and my father would have understood each other. Perhaps they would have. They sat there in the darkness, two people from opposite sides of a war, looking up at the same stars. No words were needed. The silence itself was a kind of communication, a recognition that beneath the uniforms and the flags and the hatred, they were both simply human beings trying to find their way through the wreckage of the world. 48 hours later, Harwood returned. But this time, he did not bring an order for court-martial. Division Command has more urgent matters to deal with, he said, his voice still cold but lacking its previous threat. Germany's surrender is being negotiated. No one has time for a tribunal over a few buckets of water. Tom allowed himself to breathe again. But Harwood was not finished. You are lucky, Mitchell, very lucky. He fixed Tom with a stare that could have frozen fire. But remember this. Mercy has its price. Do not let it make you forget who you are. He turned and walked back to his jeep, and moments later was gone in a cloud of dust. Tom watched him go, unsure whether he should feel relieved or disappointed. Perhaps both. Sullivan appeared beside him, a fresh cigarette already lit. That was close, Lieutenant. Too close. For what it is worth, Sullivan said, blowing a stream of smoke into the morning air. I think you did the right thing. He glanced at Tom sideways. Do not tell anyone I said that. Your secret is safe, Sergeant. Sullivan almost smiled. It was the closest thing to approval Tom had ever seen from the grizzled veteran. But the story was not over. In just a few days, orders would come through. The women would be transferred to a larger camp, and a farewell would take place that would echo across 25 years. What Tom did not know, standing there in the German spring with the smell of smoke still lingering in the air, was that a single decision about water and soap and human dignity was about to ripple forward through time in ways he could never have imagined. He did not know about the letter that would arrive decades later. He did not know about the name that would be given to a child he would never meet. He did not know that the small act of mercy he had chosen in the dying days of a terrible war would become a legacy that outlasted everything else. All he knew in that moment was that he had kept his promise to his father. He had stood before helpless enemies and chosen humanity over hatred. He had proven that even in the heart of hell, it was still possible to be a decent man. And sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that is everything. The orders came through faster than anyone expected. All remaining prisoners were to be transferred to a larger camp under Allied control. The war in Europe was stumbling toward its end, and millions of German prisoners needed to be processed, categorized, and eventually sent home to whatever remained of their homes. Tom read the transfer orders in silence. He had known this moment would come. The women could not stay here forever. They were prisoners of war, and prisoners of war had to be moved through the system like everything else in the vast machinery of military bureaucracy. But knowing something is coming and being ready for it are two very different things. The morning of the transfer arrived with a pale gray sky and a cold wind that carried the last bite of winter. A military truck had been parked at the edge of the camp since before dawn, its canvas cover flapping gently in the breeze. The driver sat in the cab smoking a cigarette waiting. American soldiers gathered to watch the departure. There were no hostile stares anymore, no muttered curses or clenched fists. The days since the shower had changed something in these men. They had seen the women laugh for the first time when the water hit their skin. They had watched them help in the camp kitchen, peeling potatoes and washing dishes alongside American cooks. They had heard them singing softly in German during the evening songs that sounded like lullabies, or hymn songs that reminded everyone of home. Jimmy Dawson, the young Texan who had hated all things German with the burning fury of a brother's grief, walked up to Greta with a chocolate bar in his hand. He thrust it toward her awkwardly, unable to meet her eyes. "Keep it," he mumbled. Long road ahead. Greta looked at the chocolate, then at the young soldier who had once glared at her with such contempt. She did not speak English well enough to say what she felt, but she nodded slowly and something passed between them that needed no translation. Forgiveness, perhaps, or at least the beginning of it. One by one, the women climbed into the truck. They moved quietly, their faces a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The camp had been a prison, but it had also been a place where they were treated with unexpected kindness. Where they were going now, they could not know what awaited them. Helga was the last aboard. She stood before Tom in the pale morning light, the sun just beginning to break through the clouds. Her hair, clean now and neatly combed, caught the first golden rays. She looked different than she had on that first day when she emerged from the ruined farmhouse with her hands raised in surrender. She looked like a young woman again, instead of a refugee from hell. "Lieutenant Mitchell," she said softly, "before I go, there is something I want to give you." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small object, a metal pin tarnished with age, but still recognizable. The emblem of the Red Cross. Tom looked at it, not understanding. "This belonged to my father, Helga," explained her voice trembling slightly. "He wore it every day when he worked at the hospital. When he died, I kept it as a way to remember him. It is the only thing I have left of him." Tom shook his head. "I cannot accept this. It is too important. Please." Helga pressed the pin into his palm, her fingers briefly touching his. "You treated us the way my father treated his patients, like human beings. I want you to have this so you will remember that even in war, there are still people like you." Her blue eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. "Danke," she whispered in German. "Thank you for treating us like people." Tom closed his fingers around the pin. He could feel its slight weight, its cool metal warming against his skin. Such a small thing, such an enormous meaning. "Take care of yourself," he said quietly. "The war is almost over. Do not let it follow you for the rest of your life." Helga smiled then. It was a real smile, the first genuine one Tom had seen from her. It transformed her face, pushing away the shadows of exhaustion and fear, revealing the young woman she had been before the world caught fire. "I will try, Lieutenant. You do the same." She turned and climbed into the truck. The tailgate was raised and latched. The engine coughed to life. As the truck began to roll forward, Helga looked back one last time. Tom raised his hand, not a military salute, just a simple gesture of farewell, of acknowledgement, of something that might have been friendship in a different world. The truck rounded the bend in the road and disappeared behind the trees. A cloud of dust hung in the air for a moment, then slowly settled back to earth. Tom stood there for a long time, staring at the empty road. In his hand, the Red Cross pin caught the morning light. Sullivan appeared beside him, silent for once, without a cigarette. The two men watched the space where the truck had vanished. "You did a good thing," Lieutenant Sullivan said finally. His voice was gruff, but there was something underneath it that might have been respect. Most men would not have bothered. Tom did not respond. He was thinking about his father, about promises kept, about what it meant to be a man in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything good. He slipped the pin into his brass pocket next to the photograph of Walter Mitchell. Two small objects, two connections to people who believed that human dignity mattered more than war. 3 weeks later, the war in Europe ended, May 8, 1945. VE Day. The guns fell silent across the continent. In cities from London to Moscow, people poured into the streets to celebrate. Church bells rang, strangers embraced. Tears of joy and grief mingled on countless faces. In the American camp, soldiers broke out whatever alcohol they had been saving. Songs echoed across the compound. Men who had not smiled in months laughed until they cried. The nightmare was over. They had survived. But Tom stood apart from the celebration, watching his men from a distance. He should have felt happy, relieved, victorious. Instead, he felt hollow. The war had taken too much from him. Friends, innocence, 4 years of his life, parts of himself that he would never get back. Sullivan found him there, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and 2 tin cups in the other. "Not celebrating, Lieutenant." "I am celebrating," Tom replied, "in my own way." Sullivan nodded and poured whiskey into both cups. He handed one to Tom and raised his own. "To the ones who did not make it," Sullivan said. "To the ones who did not make it," Tom repeated. They drank in silence while the sounds of celebration continued around them. After a while, Sullivan spoke again. "I have been thinking about those women, about what we did for them, and I think it was the only way to prove we were not the same as what we were fighting against." Sullivan drained his cup and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "The Nazis built gas chambers disguised as showers. We built real showers for our prisoners." He looked at Tom with something approaching warmth in his weathered eyes. "That is the difference, Lieutenant. That is what we were fighting for." Tom thought about that for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Thanks, Sergeant." Sullivan almost smiled. "Do not get used to it. I still do not hand out towels." The war in Europe was over. But for Tom Mitchell, the longest journey was just beginning. The journey home. Autumn of 1945. Tom returned to Columbus, Ohio. The fields where he had grown up were still there, stretching toward the horizon under the vast American sky. The corn had been harvested, leaving stubble that crunched beneath his boots as he walked the familiar paths of his childhood. The smell of earth and dying leaves filled his lungs. The sound of crows calling from the tree line echoed across the empty land. But everything else had changed. His father was gone. The farmhouse where Tom had been born now belonged to distant relatives. The friends he had grown up with were either dead or scattered to the winds. The boy who had left Ohio 4 years ago no longer existed. In his place stood a man who had seen too much and felt too deeply to ever be truly young again. Tom found work on a farm not far from where his father's land had been. Simple work, honest work, mending fences, feeding livestock, plowing fields. The rhythm of agricultural life wrapped around him like a familiar blanket, offering comfort, even if it could not heal the wounds inside. The smell of fresh hay and manure, the sound of roosters crowing at dawn, the taste of strong black coffee and crispy bacon in the morning. These were the textures of home, the small sensory details that slowly stitched him back into the fabric of civilian life. In 1948, Tom married Margaret, a schoolteacher from the local village. She had kind eyes and a gentle laugh, and a way of looking at him that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he could learn to be whole again. They had 2 children together, a boy named Walter after Tom's father, a girl named Ellen after his mother. Life settled into the quiet rhythms of rural Ohio. Seasons turned, years passed. Tom rarely spoke about the war. Like most veterans of his generation, he carried his memories in silence. The nightmares came less frequently as the decades rolled by, though they never disappeared entirely. But sometimes on spring mornings, when the sunlight caught the surface of the water tank in the corner of the farm, Tom would stop whatever he was doing and stare. The light dancing on the water would transport him back to Germany, back to the makeshift shower he had built, back to the faces of women who had expected death and received dignity instead. The Red Cross pin remained in a wooden box beside his bed next to his military medals and the photograph of his father. He never told anyone what it meant or where it came from, but he never forgot. 25 years after the war ended, everything changed again. Spring of 1970. Tom was 51 years old. His hair had turned gray at the temples. His hands bore the calluses of decades of farm work. His children had grown and left home. Life had become a comfortable routine of early mornings and honest labor and evenings on the porch, with Margaret watching the sunset over the Ohio fields. One morning, Margaret brought the mail to where Tom sat drinking his coffee on the porch. Among the usual bills and advertisements was an envelope that stood out. Foreign stamps, a return address in Germany. "There is something strange here," Margaret said, handing it to him. "A letter from overseas." Tom looked at the envelope. He did not know anyone in Germany. Or at least he thought he did not. Carefully, he opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper covered in handwriting. The English was slightly imperfect, but perfectly clear. "Dear Lieutenant Mitchell," the letter began. "You may not remember me, but I was one of the women your unit captured in 1945 near Kassel. I was the nurse who gave you my father's Red Cross pin." Tom's breath caught in his throat. He had thought about Helga Brenner many times over the years, wondered what had become of her, whether she had survived the chaos of post-war Germany. And now, after a quarter-century of silence, here was her voice reaching across the ocean. "I have lived," the letter continued. "I returned to Germany after the war ended. I rebuilt my life from the ashes. I married. I have a family. But I have never forgotten that day. The day when American soldiers let us wash. The day when, for the first time in months, I felt like a human being again. We were afraid, you know. We had heard the stories about showers from the Eastern Front. We thought that was how we would die. But instead, there was only water, clean water, and kindness. That memory is what I have carried with me through all these years. Not the memory of bombs or death or fear, but the memory of the moment when human beings treated each other with humanity. Please tell your soldiers, if any of them are still alive, that we remember their kindness, that it gave us the strength to keep living. Thank you, Lieutenant Mitchell. Thank you for being who you are." The letter was signed with a single initial. H. Tom's vision blurred. He blinked and tears ran down his weathered cheeks. For a long moment he could not speak. He could only sit there on his porch in Ohio, holding a piece of paper that had traveled 4,000 miles to deliver a message 25 years in the making. Margaret watched him with concern. "Tom, what is it?" He wiped his eyes and handed her the letter. She read it in silence, and when she finished, her own eyes were wet. "You never told me about this," she said softly. "I never told anyone." They sat together as the morning sun climbed higher, reading the letter again and again. Each word carried weight. Each sentence bridged the gap between past and present, between war and peace, between enemies who had become something else entirely. But the letter did not end there. Tom turned the page and found a postscript written at the bottom. "P.S. My daughter is 20 years old now. When she was born, I named her Thomasina. I told her it was the name of a man who gave her mother a second chance at life. She does not know the full story yet. Perhaps someday I will tell her. But every time I call my daughter's name, I remember you. And I remember that even in the darkest times, there can still be light." Tom read those words 3 times before their meaning fully sank in. Thomasina, a child named after him. A life that existed because of a decision he had made in the final days of a terrible war. A legacy he had never imagined. He thought about all the small choices that had led to this moment. The decision to build the shower. The decision to treat prisoners with dignity. The decision to be the man his father had raised him to be instead of the man that war tried to make him. Each choice had seemed small at the time. A water tank, some canvas sheets, a few hours of work. But added together, they had created something larger than he ever could have known. A ripple that spread across decades and continents. A life saved. A child born. A name that would carry his memory into a future he would never see. That night, after Margaret had gone to sleep, Tom opened the wooden box beside his bed. The Red Cross pin lay there tarnished but intact. He picked it up and held it in his palm, feeling its familiar weight. Then he placed Helga's letter in the box next to the pin and his father's photograph. 3 objects, 3 connections across time. 3 proofs that what we do matters even when we cannot see the results. "Thank you, Pa," Tom whispered in the darkness. "I kept my promise. Now I want to ask you one final question. Who does this story remind you of? Maybe your father, maybe your grandfather, maybe yourself. If this story touched something in you, leave a comment below and share your own memories, because these stories deserve to be told. This generation deserves to be remembered. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do so now. Hit that notification bell, because there are more stories like this waiting to be told. Tom Mitchell lived until 1992. He was 73 years old when he passed away peacefully in his bed surrounded by his family. At his funeral, his son Walter read the eulogy. He spoke about a father who worked hard and loved deeply, a man who taught by example rather than words, a veteran who never boasted about his service, but carried it with quiet dignity until the end. But Walter also spoke about a letter from Germany that he had found in his father's belongings, tucked into a wooden box next to a faded Red Cross pin. My father never told us the full story, Walter said, his voice steady despite the emotion beneath. But through this letter, I learned that he did something extraordinary during the war. Not by killing enemies, not by winning battles, but by treating helpless people with humanity when he had every reason to do otherwise. He paused, looking at the simple wooden casket. My father taught us that true strength is not measured by how much power you have over others. It is measured by what you choose to do with that power. He chose mercy. He chose dignity. He chose to be a good man in a world that was trying to destroy goodness. The mourners listened in silence. Many of them were veterans themselves. Many of them understood, without needing to be told, the weight of the choices Tom Mitchell had made. There is a young woman in Germany right now, Walter continued, whose name is Thomasina. She is named after my father, a man she never met, a man who for one moment in the middle of hell decided that even enemies deserve to be treated like human beings. He looked up at the gathered crowd. That is my father's legacy, not medals or honors or victories, but a simple act of kindness that echoed across 25 years and gave someone the courage to keep living. That is what he would want us to remember. History remembers wars for their blood and destruction, for the great battles and famous generals and decisive victories that shaped the fate of nations. But sometimes what truly defines a war is not what happens on the battlefield. It is what happens in the quiet moments between the fighting, when humanity breaks through the hatred, when one person chooses to see another as a human being instead of an enemy. In the final days of World War II, on a nameless road in Germany, an ordinary American lieutenant from Ohio made a choice. He could have ignored the request of his prisoners. He could have followed regulations to the letter and nothing more. He could have let hatred guide his actions, as so many others did. Instead, he built a shower. He let frightened women wash away weeks of grime and terror. He gave them something more valuable than food or shelter. He gave them dignity. That choice did not win any battles. It did not change the course of the war. It did not make headlines or earn medals. But it saved something far more important. It saved the humanity of everyone involved. The prisoners who received mercy, the soldiers who witnessed it, and the young lieutenant who proved that even in the heart of darkness, light can survive. Decades later, that light still burns. In the memory of those who were there, in the letter that crossed an ocean, in the name of a child who carries forward the legacy of a man she never knew. Because the most powerful thing a person can give is not bullets or bombs or victory. It is dignity. It is a tank of clean water. It is the chance to feel human again. And sometimes that is enough to change the world. What makes us human is not how we treat our friends. It is how we treat our enemies when they have no power left. Those words were never written on any monument or carved into any memorial, but they lived in the heart of Thomas Mitchell from Ohio. They guided his actions in the spring of 1945, and they echo still across the years, reminding us of what we can be when we choose mercy over vengeance, dignity over hatred, humanity over war. The shower he built has long since rusted away. The camp where it stood has returned to forest. The men who served under him have mostly passed on, joining the ranks of what we now call the greatest generation. But the story survives, the lesson endures. And somewhere in Germany, a woman named Thomasina carries in her very name the proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, there were those who refused to let the light go out. This is the true victory of World War II, not the conquest of territory or the defeat of armies, but the countless small acts of decency that proved we were worthy of winning. This is what we were fighting for. This is who we can still choose to be.